Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Finding Genius video series. I'm here with Packy McCormick from Not Boring, which he'll tell us a bit about in a few minutes. Before we kick it off, I just wanted to thank TriNet again for sponsoring this. TriNet helps thousands of SMBs or venture-backed startups, depending on the interviewer context, scale and lower their burn rate by offering a tech-enabled HR platform that streamlines employee benefits, payroll, and HR compliance. So again, we're here with Packy, and I appreciate you being here. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Just to kick it off, and so I don't butcher it, can you, I've been following your success for a while on this, so it'd be great if you could just briefly introduce Not Boring in your own words and what it's all about.
Sure. So Not Boring is a newsletter that I've been writing really kind of as a full-time thing for about 6 months since the beginning of quarantine. That covers everything from really, really, really big companies like the Tencents and Reliance Industries of the world, all the way down to really, really small companies, like a couple of companies that we've invested in. So on the side, we also have a syndicate kind of as part of the newsletter where the group can invest together in early stage companies. So big companies, small companies, and it's this kind of Ben Thompson meets Bill Simmons is kind of how I like to describe it. Right. So company and strategic analysis, but with a lot of fun and memes and a bunch of stuff in there to make it more approachable.
And why did you name it Not Boring? Did you feel like everything else, all the content on those types of spaces were just very dry?
It feels like a dig. I think I got lucky on that. So actually, before I was starting this, I was in the middle of starting an in-person, think about maybe a Soho House meets college extracurriculars. And I was trying to find the psychographic of the person. And I came back to this quote, which is avoid boring people, which works kind of two ways. It's avoid boring people and avoid boring people. And so decided to name it Not Boring. Obviously, coronavirus hit, not the best time for an in-person social club. So kept the name because I really like the name and just applied it to the newsletter.
Interesting. Are you doing this full-time?
I'm doing this full-time now, which is, if you told me even a year ago that I'd be writing a free newsletter full-time, I would not believe you.
And could you, I guess we'll get into that, but could you talk a bit about, you're a bit humble about kind of the beginnings. In 6 months, you've gotten several thousand subscribers and people really following and hanging on every article that you put out there. Can you talk a bit more about that and what the stats look like and how that growth has actually looked in the last 6 months?
It's been wild. So I started writing a kind of predecessor newsletter called Per My Last Email. I was taking an online writing course, had to set up a newsletter for it. And so it was really basic, sending out links that I had read for the week, maybe like a couple hundred words of my own thoughts, but really mostly talking about other people's work. When I decided to switch to this full time, I'd written a couple long essays that had been kind of well received. Grew it from the beginning of April in 2019 to about 550 people when I decided to make this my full time thing. And I set myself a goal to get to 1,000 by the end of the year. And I had a couple people be like, I think you can beat 1,000. So got to 1,000 pretty quickly. I was like, all right, if I can get to 5,000 by the end of the year, this would be amazing. Got to 5,000 pretty quickly. And so it's kind of just this compounding thing where it's grown and grown and grown. And now I think there's about 21,000 or so subscribers on the newsletter from 550, 7 months ago. So it's been really good growth, but I think, that's just a function of the audience kind of compounds on itself at a certain point.
Interesting. What was on the candid side for people that are leaving their jobs to start companies or especially kind of build a following online with content they're putting out there? What were some of your concerns, or what do the early days look like, the first couple of weeks of deciding and talking about it with your wife or your family or leaving a full-time job to do this? And what were your worries about, or how you would monetize this in the future and support yourself? Just walk us through some of that for people that are thinking about it too.
Yeah, so the big worry was actually around the social club idea. I was really excited about it. I had written a bunch actually just to kind of think through the space. And I got really excited about it. And I had put together a group of initial members and all of that. And I'd have conversations with my wife Pooja about the business itself, and she'd be like, cool, so like what's the business model here? I'm like, no, it's something like, maybe I would. And I couldn't put it into words. Actually, when I switched to doing the newsletter, because it started growing pretty quickly, it's a well-worn path that you can see. Like if I can get an audience to a certain size and they're engaged, I should be able to monetize this thing. And by the way, it opens a lot of other doors. So if this doesn't work out, my thinking is out there for better or worse in the public. And some people are going to be like, I would never hire this idiot. Right. And then other people might be like, this would be fun to work with this guy. So I think it just creates a ton of optionality. And then, there's a pretty clear path to either a subscription or advertising-based business.
Interesting. And have you started the advertising-based business or subscription yet? Or?
I have. So I actually my original plan had been, I'm going to get to, the 5,000 subscribers. At that point, I'll turn on subscriptions and people will just pay and it'll be great. And I'll convert it like 10% and I'll be making just that sweet monthly recurring revenue. I decided at some point along the way not to do that. I think
was that based off of what you'd been hearing other people do? Is that something that has worked successfully for others?
It has. And so I know a few newsletter writers who are making very good money, left good jobs, and are making more money doing subscription-based newsletters than they were at their old jobs. But I think for that to work, it really needs to be a pretty specific topic that you're covering and something that people can convince their boss to pay for. Or you have to be, Substack's had a bunch of journalists come over who bring their audience. And even if 1% of their existing audience converts, that's great. But to really get that 10% number, it has to be, there's a friend, Lenny Rachitsky, who writes a product manager focused newsletter, who's able to convert people well because they need this for their job. It tells them how to be a better PM. Whereas mine is interesting content. And I think people are, will trade on it and stuff like that, but it'd be really hard to convince a boss to do it. So at some point I decided, let me see, the audience is growing. I don't want to put a limit on that growth, which also going paid does because it caps the number of people who read it. So made a deck because I was talking to maybe the potential first advertiser, made a deck, decided just to tweet it out because I already had it. And pretty much from that initial Twitter thread with the deck, I've gotten all of the advertisers for the past 2.5 months are either from that initial thread or from people kind of referring other people based on that thread.
Wow. That's amazing. That's really good. And can you talk about some of those pieces that you've written? So you've focused and gone very deep into larger tech companies like Slack, Opendoor, Tencent, like you were mentioning. Could you talk about what forms your thesis around the company and what makes you inform and how you write that piece and what the research you're doing? Because you're putting them out fairly quickly. And you're also doing these deep dives that probably aren't anywhere else on the internet or even investors in those companies. And with Slack, I know you said you had a contrarian view based off of what's going on. Could you just talk about how you inform your thesis around some of these companies?
Sure. So some of it is, I'm coming in. Slack is an example I wrote about last week. And I've been a Slack investor since the day they IPO'd in last year. And I've been frustrated the whole time with the narrative about the company. And so sometimes it's just that there's this narrative that the market is telling that I think is wrong. And so it was like Spotify back kind of before the pandemic started and Slack, where it's like, Spotify has structurally bad margins because they have these deals with the record labels and they're never going to be able to get out of that. And so I wrote a piece essentially saying, look, once podcasts start there starts even being good news around Spotify doing more in podcasts, people will begin to see that Spotify is more than this company that just needs to pay all its money to the record labels. And then lo and behold, Joe Rogan signed a deal and the stock has done well since. And so it's kind of looking for narratives like that. For Slack, it's Microsoft Teams is this huge, massive competitor that's really coming after them. At some point, the numbers are going to be so good, and the numbers kind of are good, but they'll just compound to the point that story will break. And so I look for companies that I'm fairly familiar with that have a narrative that I think is wrong, and then use narrative kind of in, a 5,000 to 6,000 word piece to try to dismantle the bear narrative. And then in some cases, I'll just hear about a company that I want to learn more about and that I think is really fascinating. That's taken the form recently of these big emerging market mega conglomerates like a Tencent, which is the most fascinating company, I think, in the world. I wrote about FEMSA yesterday, which is the largest Coca-Cola bottler in the world that also has the largest chain of convenience stores and owns part of Heineken and might build a digital wallet. And so that is a whole nother group of companies where I don't know much about them going into it, but I know that there's something interesting there because in the emerging markets, there's all these pieces that come together in a different way than they come together in the US because there's so much less existing infrastructure build out that the companies that get there first can build that infrastructure out.
Interesting. And then you said you also are focusing on smaller tech companies, and based off of that research process that you just talked about, it sounds very similar to what a venture capitalist might do. And I don't know if I'm insulting you by saying that you're doing a similar job, but with the smaller tech companies that you're looking at, you've said that you've syndicated some of those on Angels List. So what has that process been like? And do you think that is sort of where this entire passion economy and kind of decentralized venture funds is headed with some of the smaller tech companies that you've looked at?
Sure. So for that one, I had left the company that I'd worked at for 6 years called Breather last year, hadn't really angel invested previously, but a guy that I had met through working at Breather was starting a company, and we were talking. I was going to angel invest, and he was like, "Look, I'm having a hard time in 30 minutes or in a pitch deck explaining to people why my company is not a real estate company and why it's a tech company. I've read your stuff. I think that you know how to do this. Could we like write something together on my company?" And so decided to do that. I had a friend who was syndicating the deal on AngelList. And so, getting a bunch of small checks to come together to write one big check. And so we said, look, I'll write this investment memo. We'll send the deal flow that way and we'll see how it goes. Story went really well, got shared a bunch, attracted investors outside of the syndicate, and then filled that syndicate up. So we were like, oh, there's something here. So I decided for the next kind of few that I did to set up our own Not Boring syndicate. And so now the way that it works is I'll do really like what I would do personally as an investment memo, but just make it public. And so I'll do an analysis on the company, the space that they're in, the team, all the things that you'd look for in a normal early stage investment. But unlike a traditional firm where you kind of keep that internal, at least until after the deal is closed, I'm finding founders who are excited enough and confident enough in their strategy and the fact that other people can't steal it, that they're willing to just have me tell that story to the world. And so it has all these knock-on benefits. Like I've had people hire employees based on them reading my posts, or find customers, or find bigger kind of external checks. And then we take it into a syndicate that people have joined on AngelList where they can write anything from, $1,000 to $50,000 check. And then as a collective, we're putting in a little bit over 100 per deal.
Wow. So is that kind of something that you see that maybe beyond when you start to activate subscriptions, or if you still have that in the plan, that's something that you'd offer your subscribers, is access to the deal that you're looking at? And
yeah, I mean, everything that and maybe there's, a wider funnel of deal flow that I'm not doing right now just because of time considerations that
right.
Maybe I'd give to a paid audience just to give them a look. And it's not even necessarily we're doing this deal, but hey, check out this deal. And if you want to meet the founders, I can see something like that. But almost everything that I do benefits from more eyeballs, right? So like the checks are kind of commoditized at this point. It's the fact that now these people who are often, technically 57 million times smarter than I am, but maybe not as good a storyteller, have this document that they can refer back to, and then they can share it with people and they can explain their company better and all of those things. So I think that's the benefit, and being able to reach a wider audience with that, I think is net better.
Right. And what are some of those companies that I don't know if you can talk about it, but are there some of those companies you invested in that you're willing to share and talk about, and maybe what that process has been? And have you been competing against a traditional venture seed fund for that last $100,000 check, or are you working collaboratively with them? Do you just believe this is the future of the way venture might work at the seed stage, at least?
I think it'll be a mix. I think so. I'll answer your question kind of second, but I think there's just this thing that happens with newsletters generally where people are experimenting, and they're experimenting so publicly that something works, and then a bunch of people go do that thing, and then that channel gets tired, and then you have to like kind of keep bobbing and weaving. So I'm almost certain that this will be something that people do. I don't know how well it'll work for them or for me, frankly, when there's 1,000 other people doing this. And so it's really about kind of figuring out what's actually useful for the companies and for your audience. But I think in terms of working with funds, this is really not competing. I think maybe this is competitive with just that, like, kind of well-connected angel check who might introduce you to a couple of people at some point, but really like they just want to get into the round. Right. I think it's more competitive with that, where it's like you could take that check and maybe they'll introduce you to 1 or 2 people, or I can send a memo out to 21,000 people who will then share it with other people, and then we can kind of go from there. And so I think it's just a different kind of value that I can bring. I'm definitely a worse investor than most of those people probably, but it's just a different kind of service. And so maybe building, a cap table that has people who can do a bunch of different things for you, that's always been, a good move. And now this is just kind of one more arrow in the quiver. And so a couple of deals that I've done. That first one was a company called Apt that's doing low-rise multifamily development on single-family lots, which essentially means they're taking lots that have one house on them right now that are zoned to be able to have small apartment buildings on them, identifying them with technology, and then building this kind of end-to-end process where they take investor money from one side of the marketplace, they contract out the work from the other side, so they're not actually doing any of the building, but they kind of keep the whole value chain together in the product that they build. And I think that's really going to be an important thing in construction generally, because normally you have this challenge where each person kind of wants to get paid the most, and spend the least money throughout the value chain. And so you end up with a product that maybe looks really great right now, but doesn't work so well in 5 years. And there's all these issues that kind of come about through just people sharing kind of that risk and responsibility. So that's one. I actually did, and I was really worried about this one. My sister runs a company in Ghana called Oze, and it's a fintech company that essentially replaces the paper ledger with a mobile app. And then that allows you to do all sorts of things. So it's like Kata Book in India, which by bringing all of these things that you would have written down, a small business would have written down, like I just made, $5 on this water bottle that I sold.
Right.
And so now that one enables them to make smarter business decisions, but more importantly, enables them to take loans and pay back. And so now they're kind of moving up the stack to becoming a lender as well and working with large banks to lend to these businesses and really kind of providing a credit rating on businesses that a couple of years ago would never have been able to access credit. And so I think that's a theme in a lot of different emerging markets. And so that one, actually, I was worried because it was my sister, was our most oversubscribed deal yet and brought in big checks on the outside that dwarfed the size of the round. So that was very cool. And just a few others. I have not kind of defined it. What's that?
You did that all through AngelList.
All through AngelList.
Wow.
AngelList makes it very easy.
Yeah, I'll have to try that. And so with what are some of the other topics that you've done some of the bigger tech companies, Slack, Opendoor, Tencent, and some newer ones that maybe people haven't heard of as much. What are some of the other areas that you're looking to cover in the next newsletter, or one big topic that you just haven't wrapped your head around yet that you want to go after?
That's a really great question. I think so. One part of my process that is I need to fix, but I haven't figured out how to yet, is that right now, for example, I have no idea what I'm writing on Monday, and I typically won't until Thursday. And then I spend, 4 days in a row, including Saturday, Sunday, working 12 hours a day to do the research and put it all together. So I think forward and I have a list of topics that I want to write about. But then by the time I look at it, I'm like, these feel kind of stale. And so then I have to think of something new on the spot, not sustainable, need to figure that out. I think one big one I wrote about recently is this idea of software eating the markets, but essentially people viewing investments a different way than they have in the past, particularly retail investors, where it's like a fun thing to be able to buy Slack and be part of the conversation on Twitter. And I mean, Tesla is a perfect example of this, or Bitcoin or whatever else, where sure, part of it is the financial value, but if you're comparing it to something that you used to spend money on, like a concert ticket or going to a movie where there's entertainment value as well, I think that it kind of broadens the base of people who might invest in the market. Plus the fact that there's all these different asset classes that you can invest in now on, StockX, you can buy sneakers, right. You can do art, fractional shares of real estate. So just this idea that everything is kind of being financialized and the access is there. I wrote a piece on it, but that feels like it just has so many more layers to unpack. So I feel like that'll be a theme that kind of keeps coming back in and out.
And so when you're doing research on a place like that, you said 4 days and 10, 12 hours a day. What's your process? Do you have a process that kind of goes from company to company? It doesn't matter what company you're looking at, or are there certain things that you're using to get smart?
Yeah, it's really all over the place. So typically somebody will have written something very good about the company. That's a starting point. And we'll maybe address one of the pieces that I want to talk about. So normally there's a good company history out there. There was a really great 13,000 word piece on Tencent written in Mandarin that I had to use the Google Translate version of to get that. When I see that, though, I get really excited because you can get that information, but it's something that clearly a lot of people don't have access to in my audience. So that's really fun. But it'll be kind of some combination of things that have already been written, a little bit of kind of what the Twitter conversation around that company is, something about their financials. So I use an Atom Finance to look up the company financials and histories and all of that. And then it's really listening to as much or watching as much of the founders' presentations or podcast interviews or all of that to hear how the company tells its own story and how that's evolved over time. And then try to figure out where I think that's maybe a little bit of BS and they're spinning, some optimistic version that they hope to be true. And then where I think that's actually what's happening and what the roadmap actually looks like.
That's interesting. How do you deal with putting out content where you have a lot of voices on Twitter and just in the tech sphere of people who really believe in what they're saying in a very strong way. So how do you deal with someone that's putting out content that maybe others disagree with? Or do you face a lot of negative feedback on some of the stuff that you've put out in the past? Or is it pretty supportive community when you are putting something out there?
It's been way more supportive than I expected. And so part of part of not choosing a particular focus area, and particularly like not choosing real estate tech, which is the last company that I worked for, is that I'm coming into all these conversations as a total outsider and trying to at least get smart on what people in the industry are talking about around that company and what even the language is and what the important metrics are. So every time I hit send on a profile of a company in an industry that I don't know, I'm worried that I'm like, this is the time that everybody in the industry is going to be like, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. Like I wrote one on, the DTC value chain and Porter's Five Forces and all these different things. And I was like, I don't work in DTC. Like, I think people are going to rip this one apart and tell me that I got it wrong. Right. And particularly because it was a little bit negative and kind of said like, because it's so easy with Shopify and other things now to start an e-commerce company, so much of kind of where the competition has moved into marketing that it's like a really tough business because it's so approachable and so easy for people to do. I thought I'd get shredded for that. And people reached out and were like, thank you. I've been trying to tell my company this or like X, Y, or Z, and I didn't have a framework for it.
Yeah.
So certainly one of these days I'm going to get it totally wrong and get blasted. But if I've gotten it wrong, I have not gotten blasted yet.
Yeah, no, that's good. So what tips do you have for people that are like this just goes even beyond newsletters, but even if we focused it on that and putting out content on growth hacking, you've really developed an engaged audience and beyond just putting out interesting content. What tips can you share with people on really developing that?
Yeah, so I think the answer that you don't want to hear is like, I've put out 18 months, I've put out something every week. Right. So that consistency is very important. And the content itself, like I think one thing would be to just be different than what's out there. And so I'm writing about a topic that a lot of people write about, and I really resisted writing about business strategy and finance for a while. But I think I'm doing it differently enough and writing these like 5,000 to 6,000 word pieces that combine the serious analysis with memes and just like kind of making it more fun.
Right.
That's different. And all the advice that I got was, you're writing, even when I was writing 3,000 word pieces, that's way too long. Nobody's going to read that. Make it shorter, make the highlights more easily kind of digestible and all of that. Accidentally, just because it takes way more time to edit down, I went the opposite way. And I think because I'm one of the only people doing every week a really long deep dive, it's just a unique thing. And that unique thing could be anything. So I'd say find that thing that's unique about your content and copycat in the beginning until you get your legs under you, and then figure out the way that you want to take it. There are other kind of, every single time I write something, I'm on Twitter posting it, potentially doing a thread. I think threads have actually gotten a little cliche now too, so I've stopped doing them quite as much, but they do make 5,000 words a lot more approachable. Yeah. But really it's that cycle of like being part of the conversation on Twitter, writing something, putting it back out there, engaging with everybody who replies, all of that I think is really, really valuable. And find whichever channel, if it's LinkedIn, it's LinkedIn. If it's Facebook, God help you. But if it's Facebook, it's Facebook. So I think that's a big one. One thing that I did, and again, I think this speaks to just differentiate, but when I was at 1,500, we decided to just put up a simple landing page and launch it on Product Hunt. And that got to number 2 on Product Hunt because I already had a little bit of an engaged audience. And so they went and upvoted it, and then it went up, and I went from 1,500 to like 3,500 subscribers in 2 days. Now I think, and I was definitely not the first person to do that, but now everybody does it. So the channel's gotten a little more stale, but just like find that thing where there's going to be a bunch of people. And if you do something different and get it right, it'll be a big boost. And then, like I said, like that just kicks off a flywheel where it just keeps growing as people share.
It's really great. So just to wrap it up, I don't want to take too much of your time. What's the future of Not Boring? Like, what are you thinking? Is it going on different channels? Is it going on different mediums? Is it continuing to go down the same path as it's working? What are you thinking?
Yeah, Not Boring will certainly get stale at some point as well, if it's not already. Like asking people to read 5,000 to 6,000 words every week is a lot. And so I think figuring out other ways to make that content more digestible and consumable. So do I start making videos out of them, or I read them on audio now, but is there kind of some podcast that goes with it? I think there is an opportunity, and I don't know if I'm going to take it or not, but research reports are so dry and so bad and so closed off that I think there's an opportunity, and I'm not nearly a good enough financial modeler to do this, but working with, either MBA interns or board kind of investment bankers or somebody building kind of research reports around these companies that combine the narrative and the numbers, I think that would be an interesting paid product. But I think I'm just going to keep kind of bobbing and weaving.
Yeah. that'd be great. We should talk about that more. But I really appreciate this, Packy. This is super helpful. And I know a lot of your followers and my very few compared to yours will really enjoy this. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me. This was fun.